30 minutes. I have 30 minutes before I need to be on a Zoom call. It's fine. It's fine. I can do this. It's fine. Do it. Hey, whoever's out there, I go by Grimblebug and I'm currently reading The Ables by Jeremy Scott, I think. Yes, Jeremy Scott. This is it. Part 4 of my first wrap-up series on BookTube. You've seen the fantasy novels, you've seen the other kind of novels, you've seen the graphic novels, and the first part of the comics. If you haven't, click on the link in the cards up above or down in the description box to check those videos out. Today we'll cap off my July 2020 reads with the rest of the comics I read, as well as my introductory experience to manga. Will this be posted before August ends? I don't know, but I'm choosing to tell myself that it doesn't matter. Somehow in July, I came across The Only Living Girl Volume 1. This is the start to a series of comics, but that series itself is a follow-up to a previous series called The Only Living Boy. These are both written by David Gallagher and illustrated by Steve Ellis, and I picked this up based on reviews saying that you could jump into the universe here without reading the prior series without too much trouble, which was important to me since my library had copies of this set, but not its predecessor. The jumping in here bit is technically true. We start off with a new protagonist from the original series who's just waking up after what seems like she might have slipped through the end of the world. We get some basic background info and introductions to the world we're in. That said, I was immediately intrigued by that world, and I had too many questions to be content with what I got as a shallow overview. So I personally was too distracted to enjoy what was going on, so that was my jumping in experience. Fortunately, though my brick and mortar library only has The Only Living Girl, The Only Living Boy, it turns out, is available in its entirety on Hoopla. So I'm gonna go back and read through that first, and then circle back to this follow-up series. To give you an idea though, these are sci-fi series that center on a patchwork planet. A world that was itself created by several other worlds apparently colliding, or at least that's what I've gathered. We've got lots of adventure, lots of danger, a supervillain or two who may or may not include a mad scientist with a tragic backstory. Again, I'm not entirely sure, but there's definitely a dose of memory loss that our protagonists are struggling with, which, I mean, frankly, I feel like I could relate to given how sketchy my understanding of the series currently is. I've seen it classified as both young adult and middle grade, but what I saw of the sci-fi elements seemed pretty intense, so honestly, I don't know much about this world or its stories, despite reading the first 3 issues in this portion, but I'm curious to find out, so that's a good start, I guess? Let's go to book 2. Like many people, I was thrilled to see that Avatar: The Last Airbender came to Netflix this summer. The last time I watched this series through, I hadn't gotten into comics yet because that's fairly recent for me. Suffice it to say that that has been rectified, so I was super excited after finishing my most recent watch through of this show. Why am I pointing here? There's not going to be anything here yet. Whatever, maybe I'll put up a picture of Momo or something. I was really excited to rewatch the series again, but then keep going in this world and read the comics, which I started with The Promise, which is the first arc of the comic series that follows the events of Avatar and bridges the gap between the series and The Legend of Korra. Well, all of the comics do, not just The Promise. We're barely scratching the surface. If you have not watched Avatar, fix that. First of all, you'll thank me, go do it. But also, if you're concerned about big picture spoilers for the series, go ahead and skip to this part of the video because these comics deal with the aftermath of the series conclusion. How do you do justice to an invaded nation generations after the fact, while also avoiding harm to the colonizers' descendants who themselves had nothing personally to do with the original wrongs? Loaded question, right? This is the issue at the heart of the Promise arc, which comprises 3 issues following the aftermath of Aang's defeating Fire Lord Ozai. We jump back into this world and get to look at the complex political and social repercussions of the 100 Years' War, as well as the fact that that war has ended. Aiming to set right what his father and grandfather have done to the world, Zuko has agreed to end the Fire Nation's occupation of the Earth Kingdom by removing all Fire Nation colonies and their inhabitants. The thing is, the colonists aren't just Fire Nationers anymore. They've lived in the Earth Kingdom for generations. And with citizens of the Earth Kingdom that they have intermarried and started families with, they have created their own culture that is very firmly a hybrid of the two. Families have intermixed, creating multicultural lineages and building families that bridge the divide between these two populaces. To basically deport the descendants of the original colonists, Zuko realizes it is to also force these people out of their only home and heritage that they have ever known. Underlying all of this, Zuko is determined to do everything he can to keep from becoming his father. And Aang promised Zuko long ago, well, sometime after the war probably, but it seems like it was long ago, he promised that if it ever appeared that Zuko was at risk of following in his father's footsteps, Aang would do whatever was necessary to save his friend and the world from another Fire Nation tyrant. Aang and Zuko are both left really struggling with how they can do right by their friends, their people, the nations, really, that they're sworn to protect in different ways, and their world as a whole, while still keeping up their ends of the promises that they've made. I was very pleasantly surprised, but looking back, I don't know why I was surprised, at the complicated and nuanced questions that this story explores about politics and culture, and setting right past wrongs at risk of victimizing a whole new set of people. I also loved this, I'm gonna say it. I loved the struggle that Zuko is having with how he feels about his father. As he's trying to figure out how to rule well and be a good leader, Zuko is also starting to realize that the decisions he's faced with are rarely going to be black and white. And maybe Ozai, who Zuko is terrified of one day becoming anything like, maybe Ozai has some virtues as a leader after all, or at the very least, maybe he has some insight and experience that Zuko can learn from. I had a few complaints, mostly with the second issue, the middle one, where some things were made into plot devices that I felt were a little artificial. Some characters made decisions based on convictions that seemed totally out of left field for their characters and at complete odds with what we had seen of them throughout the series as a whole. So that was a little frustrating, and I felt like certain decisions were made simply because they were convenient in moving the plot along and telling the story that the writers wanted to tell. Also, Aang and Katara use pet names for each other, and I can't get behind it. It feels weird. I don't like it. I like them together. I don't like the pet names. Overall, though, I loved this as a start to the comics. I felt like it really bridged the gap between Avatar: The Last Airbender and Legend of Korra in terms of the complexity and the gray morality of the problems and themes that we're exploring. I also really like that both Zuko and Aang are continuing to struggle with the shades of gray in their respective roles. Just because the war is over doesn't mean that either character has done all the growing that they need to do. They each throughout the series had core internal obstacles that they grappled with, and those things don't end or get any easier just because they saved the world. They continue dealing with those inner conflicts, and that is the kind of depth that caused me to fall in love with this series in the first place. Well, that and Appa, let's be real. Here, we're going to start jumping into the manga I promised. So my intention was not necessarily to get into manga. I wasn't against that idea, but I was a little intimidated. It seemed like this whole other world of media with its own rules and classification systems and artistic culture that I didn't even know where to start with it. But then I heard about My Brother's Husband, and I wanted to read it. Not because it was manga, but because of the story concept, so I did. Unfortunately, my library had the first 2 volumes, and I read both of those in July. These were created by Gengoro Tagami, and they focus on the perspective of Yaichi. Yaichi is a work-from-home, more or less single father who lives in Japan, and we meet him just as Mike, a big, burly Canadian dude with a very sunny disposition, shows up on his doorstep. Mike, it turns out, was married to Yaichi's twin brother, whom Yaichi had been estranged from, and who had gone off and built a life with Mike, his husband, in Canada. Sadly, the brother recently passed away, and now Mike is here in Japan to see the home that his husband always wanted to show him in person. This story looks at the cultural treatment of homosexuality in Japan and the ways in which families can internalize those biases, regardless of where they are, by the way. This isn't just a thing about Japanese culture, but it's specifically exploring it within that cultural context. Kengoro Sagami himself is a gay man, which I think is important to note, and Yaichi struggles with this cultural conceptualization of homosexuality. He has received and internalized a lot of messages about that concept of men loving other men or women loving other women from his culture, and how this idea of gay individuals are somehow deviant and a negative influence. But in watching Kana, his young daughter, fall head over heels for Mike, because you can't not once you meet this guy, like, he's just adorable, Yaichi is forced to confront his own prejudices and to question what merits this idea could possibly have, that there's something wrong with someone simply because of who they love. The more he learns of Mike and his brother, posthumously, the more he can see firsthand that they're good people. They're not deviant in any way. They just happen to fall in love with a person of the same gender and decided to build a life with them. He also starts coming to terms with the ways in which these internalized prejudices created distance between himself and his brother when his brother came out to him. And that's a relationship that he just can't get back now. The story touches on grief in a couple of different contexts and the quiet process of owning, confronting, and trying to combat our latent beliefs about other people and groups of people. I loved how a big part of this process for Yaichi is watching his daughter, who's too young to have fully been programmed, so to speak, with these biases of her greater society. And this lets her be completely uninhibited in getting to know and appreciate Mike in such a pure, uncorrupted way that kids are about other people. That contrast plays a huge part in helping Yaichi recognize just how insidious prejudice is, and how deep-seated it has become within himself and the other adults around him. This also looks at the idea of family and how they don't always look the way that we expect them to. But at the end of the day, the exact configurations and relationships really don't matter. What makes a family is love and support and appreciating individuals for the unique things that they bring into your life. I love this, if that wasn't clear. It is quiet. A lot of dialogue and character development is really happening within Yaichi's own head and among his inner thoughts. And that works really well given what this is exploring. This paints an impactful picture of what it's like to confront our own culture and biases and really struggle with them internally. And so despite the fact that action-wise, not a ton seems to happen objectively over these books, it feels like we have come so far from where we start to where we end, at least at the end of volume 2. So to clarify, I read volumes 1 and 2, and I was under the impression that was all that existed, because that's all that my library has, and volume 2 ends in a place that lends itself pretty well to being a stopping point for the series. But it turns out there are 2 more volumes. My library just doesn't have copies, so I need to figure out how to get my hands on them, because this was a wonderful story. So it was at this point, after reading My Brother's Husband, that I realized, hey, manga! This is a whole new world of graphics-based content that I can read. I want more! So I did some Googling, and I decided to pick up book 1 of the Saturn Apartments series by Hisai Iwaoka. I'm going to Google for these Japanese names. I'm not familiar with Japanese pronunciation, so I'm totally relying off of Google, and it's kind of sketchy at best, so if anybody knows better, please by all means correct me. Like My Brother's Husband, this is very much a character-driven story, and could probably be classified as slice of life. We're looking sometime in the distant future? Probably. It seems fairly distant to me. And the whole of the Earth has been designated a nature preserve. So all the people got kicked out, basically. Presumably because we can't be trusted with our environment. No big. People now live in what is called the Saturn Apartments. And basically, these are a massive space station, orbiting city. Mankind has built this ring-shaped structure that encircles the atmosphere of the Earth. And that ring contains all of mankind. This is a highly stratified society, both class-wise and physically. The majority of people live in very crowded quarters down in the lower levels. These are the tiers closest to the Earth. So Earth, And then if you look at like a cross section, here's the ring that's going around the Earth, and then the lower levels will be these closest to the Earth. This is probably a terrible way of demonstrating this, but oh well. These levels are dark and cramped and feel like you're in the heart of a city that's maybe not living its best life. The middle section seems to be where a lot of business takes place. It's where office buildings are and schools are located there, and you actually get some nature and sunlight up here, though it's all highly regulated and protected. If you pick a real life flower, for instance, that's growing on a patch of grass somewhere that's been carefully cultivated, you may or may not be arrested for stealing that flower. And finally, the upper levels, the outermost layer of the apartments, are where the elite and wealthy and highly privileged live. They have lots of space, direct access to sunlight, lots of disposable income for luxuries, and access to these upper levels is highly restricted. You have to have an actual pass or some kind of appropriate credentials in order to get up there. Our protagonist, Mitsu, is from the lower levels and has just graduated from school. He's taken a job that his deceased father once held and actually died while performing, and that is working for the guild of, wait for it, window washers. It's these people's jobs to go out onto the exterior of the ring. So you're in a spacesuit and protective gear and such, because otherwise you can't breathe and you're exposed to high levels of radiation. And they clean the widows, usually at the homes of the upper elite, because this is just such a costly and dangerous service. Mitsu is having some really big thoughts about his place within all this and whether his life and what he does really matters in the grand scheme of things. The cool thing about this story is that Mitsu's job puts him in a position to literally look in on the lives of people at this upper level of the social strata. Each chapter gives us a glimpse into the life of someone living within this highly stratified society. The phrase that kept coming to mind as I was reading this was, "It's bigger on the inside." I mean that both in terms of the structure of the Saturn Apartments, because as Mitsu looks down through the windows he's cleaning, he gets glimpses into these entire private worlds of people living there. He gets to see them as individuals, as people, rather than just as what are basically ants moving along within this giant structure. But it's also true of the storytelling. It can be so slow and quiet at times that it feels almost like nothing is happening. But then we watch as these subtle cracks start to form where Mitsu gets to peek through and observe the inner worlds of the various apartment residents. We don't see the whole picture, but we get just the hint of what's there, and it leaves us with a sense of just how much life is happening in such very, very different ways throughout this complex. Know what you're getting into with this. Like I said, it is very character driven, it's very slow paced, and it's introspective. And it doesn't always feel like there's as much emphasis on the depth of the story of all of our characters, so much as almost like a sampler of the lives that we get to peek in at. If you go in with the right expectations, hopefully you can enjoy this quiet, thoughtful world in the same way that I did, but it is definitely not for everyone. So if you're very much plot driven, if you can't stand a quiet, gentle sort of pace of story, this isn't for you. But if you're up for those things, it's something very special, I think. Last one. I continued my manga exploration and picked up volume 1 of Kakuriyo, Bed and Breakfast for Spirits. This was adapted by Wako Ioka from a series of Japanese light novels, which is a type of novel usually targeting teens or young adults that has illustrations throughout in the manga or anime style. I've learned a lot in the past couple months about Japanese media, if that wasn't clear. Kakuriyo follows Aoi, who is a college student with the ability to see spirits. This is something she shared with her deceased grandfather, who basically saved her from orphanhood and raised her. One day she is taken by a spirit to Kakuriyo, the spirit realm, where she learns that her grandfather was a frequent visitor, specifically of a bed and breakfast run by an ogre. It turns out that her grandfather owes the spirit a debt, a big debt. He kind of got drunk and wrecked the place. And he promised that if he didn't manage to pay the debt off, the ogre could have his granddaughter. The ogre gives Aoi the option between marrying him or being eaten. But Aoi goes for option number 3. She suggests that she instead work at the bed and breakfast and pay off her grandfather's debt that way. The first volume shows us Aoi's introduction into this world, figuring out what in the world is going on, and then trying to find someone within the bed and breakfast that will give her a job, despite a very clear prejudice and contempt that spirits in general hold for humans. I liked this. I don't feel like we got a ton of meat in this first installment. We're mostly being introduced to the world and the main players and Aoi herself, whom I liked as a protagonist so far. She's a little quiet and unassuming, but she's bold when she needs to be. So she hits this nice middle ground of being practical and logical, but reasonably confused and angry at her grandfather when she finds out all of this. So I'm excited to read more of this. I'm looking forward to getting a little more depth to the stories and the characters. But in the meantime, I appreciate that this series can kind of be a primer almost in Japanese supernatural creatures. That's not a realm of mythology that I'm familiar with, and the creator made sure to put an appendix in the back where we get some descriptions and background of each of the beings that we encounter, and there are a lot. So that was really great. We did it! We did the thing! That is everything that I read in July of 2020, which I guess means that I need to do August now, but one thing at a time. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up for me. If you want to see more, make sure that you subscribe. And before we sign off, I will leave you with a question. Have your reading tastes changed since the pandemic started? This is something that I have noticed about myself, and I'm curious whether it's true for anyone else. I've been going for more escapist and lighthearted reads. I've been reading a lot of middle grade, which I didn't really do a lot with before. And I've also found myself reaching for shorter books or things that in general will just read through quicker because I feel like they can give me a sense of accomplishment that I need more of right now in more consistent doses. What about you? Are there any changes in what you're picking up? If so, how? Let me know down in the comments. Thanks so much for hanging out. I hope you read something great today, and I will see you when I see you.